Hi everyone, my name is Akash Singh and I recently graduated from Technical University of Delft. I welcome you all to my presentation on the title Enhancing Flexibility in Project Scope with the help of Value Engineering, and this was my graduation thesis. The project starts with collecting the requirements that are translated into a system. The system is responsible to fulfill the functional requirements, which is called the scope of the project. Or in layman language, it means what do we have to build. In addition, flexibility stands for capability to adapt to a new, different, or changing requirements. So our aim was to enhance flexibility in project scope with the help of value engineering. A project is divided into three different phases. The first one is the front end phase, the second one is the execution phase, and the last one is the operational phase. So in this research, we focused on the front end phase in which the scope is defined and plans are made. So the question arises, why do we need flexibility in project scope? So there are several reasons for that. The first one is during the development of the scope, the collaborating parties expect some flexibility in the project scope to add or eliminate the developments and the opportunities according to their needs and requirements. But it is observed that the client prefers to keep the scope of the project tightly framed. It is observed that the client have a risk-averse attitude towards the involvement of the stakeholders because the scope might go over budget or lead to delays in the project. In addition, there is not sufficient room to implement the requirements for the collaborating stakeholders. This can be a problem for complicated and long-term projects, especially in area processes. The collaborating parties mainly want space in the solution. Construction projects are long-term projects. It can take up to 5, 10, or maybe 15 years too. So for example, a preferred scope from 2008 is still being worked out in 2021. You have to ask yourself whether you can still rigidly stick to the space or there should be some room for changes to match with the changing circumstances. Let's take an example. Reducing the carbon dioxide emissions is the need of the society. There is a need to move towards sustainable solutions. Prescribing certain sustainable techniques can assure the project of a sustainable approach. But during the long-term duration of the project, a more efficient technology is introduced in the projects as technology is advancing rapidly. Now, what do we expect? The client would just leave the opportunity for implementing such technology, which can be an added value to their project, or they can have some room in their scope to implement the change, which can be an added value to their projects. So like every coin has two faces, flexibility can be a disadvantage. If you always want to include all kinds of developments, you will never get out of the way. So the client have to be smart about their choices. Practically, the cost for change in scope is the lowest at the beginning of the project, and hence the scope should be flexible enough to incorporate the change at the beginning. After understanding what is flexibility in project scope and why do we need it, it was time to identify the enablers which can help to enhance flexibility in project scope. So in layman language, enabler is a thing which can make something possible. In total, 13 enablers were identified, and the three most important ones which you can see on the slide were chosen for further research. The first one was broad task definition, which stands for looking at the project from the broader view instead of narrow solutions. The second one was embrace change, which stands for implementing the change in scope. And the last one was interact among the stakeholders, which means the tendency of the actors or the stakeholders to influence each other by their actions in terms of communication, trust, collaboration, commitment, and their involvement. So now our aim was to implement the three enablers in the project to enhance flexibility. So interviews were conducted with several project managers and their teams, and after the discussion, it was observed that they are facing some challenges for implementing the three enablers in their project. A list of 15 barriers which can hinder the implementation of the enablers was formulated, which is categorized into 4 categories as mentioned in the table. Some of the most important barriers were solution-oriented thinking, which means that there is a tendency that whenever we see a problem, we jump to the solution instead of understanding the core need of the problem or the project, which limits the flexibility in scope. Followed by lack of trust among the stakeholder, their limited involvement during the development of the scope. But it is possible that different barriers might be more important in other projects depending on their situation. So, to implement the enablers, we are required to resolve the barriers. So we wanted to see or check if value engineering can help in resolving the barriers. Before checking that, we observe that there is lack of awareness about the potential benefits of performing value engineering in a construction project. Hence, we identified 21 benefits of conducting value engineering in a project, out of which the most important one are mentioned on the slide, which consist of enhancing collaboration among the stakeholders, enhancing commitment, and looking at the project from the broader view. Now, to answer our main research question, value engineering can help in resolving the barrier for implementing the three enablers for enhancing flexibility. We took 2 infrastructure projects and interviewed the project team involved in the respective projects. So in the first project, or the case 1, during the development of the scope, the client did not involve the main stakeholder closely. Their requirements were collected, but they were never implemented in the final scope. Now, when the scope was presented to the main stakeholder, they did not accept it. In short, there was a conflict in both the parties, and the project could not be realized. Now, looking at the situation, the project manager introduced value engineering as an intervention for the development of the scope of the project together with the main stakeholders. By going to the functional level, the client realized that the original scope is in conflict with the needs of the main stakeholder. And later, both the parties worked together during the development of the scope in the various steps of value engineering. The project manager mentioned during the interview that after introducing value engineering, both the parties, that was the client and the main stakeholder, were in a better position to negotiate, as we had a better understanding about each other's interests and requirements from the project. This table is shown this table is also shown in the prior slides, and the reason to show it again is that now we wanted to observe the presence of these barriers in the case 1 until the time value engineering was introduced in the project. The table reflects the number of barriers experienced by the project team until the time value engineering was introduced in the project. The second column is in the table reflects the 15 barriers for implementing the enablers. The last 3 columns with the heading enabler 1, 2, and 3 depicts the particular enablers that are broad task definition, embrace change, and interaction among the stakeholders. And the checks or the ticks mentioned in these 3 columns reflects the observed barriers in the project until the time value engineering was introduced. For example, the first barrier, that was solution-oriented thinking, it was experienced by the project team for the implementation of the enabler 1, that was broad task definition. Now, in the second case, we followed a similar approach and we interviewed the project team. It was observed that the project manager was already aware of the enablers and the benefits of conducting value engineering in a project because of his prior experiences, and hence the enablers were implemented in the project from the beginning, and value engineering was already introduced during the development of the scope. The same approach, we observed the barriers in the second case, which were experienced by the practitioners in their project after performing value engineering their project. So these were the 4 barriers that were experienced in the case 2 by the project team. Now, in the next step, this is one of the most important slide of this presentation, because this was the main finding. So in this step, both the projects were compared to understand if value engineering can help in resolving the barriers. In the first project, value engineering was an intervention and it was not the first choice of the client. On the other hand, in the second project, value engineering was introduced as a proactive approach from the beginning. It was introduced from the beginning during the development of the scope. Overall, by comparing both the projects, it was deduced that the project in which value engineering was not introduced during the development of the scope experienced 13 barriers. In comparison, the project in which value engineering was introduced from the beginning of the project experienced 4 barriers. So it can be concluded based on the 2 projects, value engineering can help in resolving the barriers for enhancing the flexibility in the project scope. The last step was to resolve the observed barriers, for which a framework was developed, which was one of the output of this research. The framework mainly consists of 3 steps that were spread awareness, engage the stakeholders, and conduct value engineering. Spreading awareness was the first step according to the proposed framework. The process begins with identifying the enablers for flexibility in project scope and creating awareness about them. It is advisable to the project managers or the employees in the organization who have past experiences of implementing the enablers for spreading awareness about the enablers and the methodologies for implementing the enablers among the higher management. After making the higher management aware and gaining their support, it is time for the scope development process in which the stakeholders should be engaged. So during this process, it is advisable to involve the stakeholders from the beginning. Here, involving the stakeholder does not merely means that stakeholder will only act as validators, and rather involvement refers to encouraging them to engage with the project team during each step of the scope development process, at least until the scope of the project is developed at the abstract level. Once everyone is on board and aware of the objectives, it is time to conduct a value engineering study, and implementing these 3 steps during the development of the scope can help in enhancing flexibility in project scope. So this brings us to the end, and I would like to thank you all for your time and attention, and I would now be interested to hear from you with you and your thoughts or questions. Please feel free to ask now. Yeah, thank you.